Hi guys, and welcome to the show. And today we are tackling a subject a little bit late, as this watch was released at the beginning of the month of November 2017, the Timex Marlin Reissue. Now, of course, before I get into this review, I have to do a quick wristwatch check. I am wearing my little World War II Omega, the pilot's watch. I forget the reference, but I've done a video all about it. I think it was the Dunkirk video about the Omegas used in World War II, and specifically in the Dunkirk movie. This is actually from the later part of the war, 1945, slightly different model to the one in the film. But yeah, I'm wearing it on the Urban Gentry Valor strap. Anyway, so wristwatch check done. Now we should rewind a little bit about the Timex Marlin, because as you guys know, and you see it here before you, I've been a massive fan of the Marlin watch for a number of years now, and I've got to give a shout out and a big thanks to Abdiel, who really got me into it. I fell in love with the watch. He kept posting, I think on Instagram or the Facebook, I neglect to remember, but he had it on a wonderful NATO strap, and it just looked amazing. It was so elegant and small and thin, and I had to get one. And then the love affair started. And what was astonishing at the time, and you still pick them up on the used market, I found one for $30, and if you check the numbers, a lot of these were made in the United Kingdom, because of course Timex had a manufacturing plant in Dundee. So to have a watch made in the United Kingdom that is so elegant, from a historic brand with a long legacy and certainly horologically important like Timex, just absolutely phenomenal. So yeah, I've been banging on about the Timex Marlin for quite a while, and Timex is a really important brand. You know, true horologists will know of its significance. You know, we discussed the Mickey Mouse watch just the other day in the watches that will under $200 that will double in value. The Mickey Mouse watch, for those of you who missed that episode, was hugely important because it actually rescued Timex from bankruptcy during the end of the Depression in the 1930s. Became an icon of watches, as it was the first to be officially licensed by the cartoon by Walt Disney, of course. Featured the Mickey Mouse with the hands that were actually the hands for the time as well. So very, very cool, and I think it was their first watch that sold over 1 million timepieces. But their history is hugely rich, full of a ton of icons. You only have to look at their military watches and right up to the modern age with, I've included, this is a beautiful little Waterbury. This is one of their newer timepieces, including, of course, technology of their own, like the Indiglo there, which is really, really cool. So even though, they've stopped making mechanical pieces in the 80s, as so many companies went under with the quartz crisis of the 70s, they switched to the quartz, and this is the first mechanical timepiece that they've done in a very, very long time. I think since the 80s. I might be wrong about that. So this is the reissue of the classic Marlin. So it's a manual wind watch, and it's extremely faithful to the 1965 Marlin. Now, the Marlins started, I think, in the late 50s. There's wonderful vintage adverts. They named after the fish, of course, for their robustness and ability to be waterproof. One of my favorite adverts is the one with Rocky Marciano, with the slogan "Takes a licking but keeps on ticking," and he's actually wearing one of the smaller Marlins in the photo, and he's punching a punch bag. So they really are robust. I mean, this one from 1968 that I own is still going strong. They're not the best timekeepers in the world, but due to the simplicity of their workhorse movements, I mean, they're really not pretty to look at, but they just keep on going. They really do. However, the reissue is slightly different. You could almost say it's a little bit more refined than the originals. There's certainly upgrades in the materials. We have a stainless steel case this time, entirely stainless steel, as the 1965 original was chrome plated, and mine is also chrome plated. Mine is slightly later, and you can see the difference in the numerals. They both have applied numerals. Mine are a little bit more boxy, and there was a great variation. I've seen stunning examples with purple sunburst dials, all different kind of hands, numerals, and then they carried on into the 70s. So they've kept very faithful to the original kind of UFO-shaped case, with these stunning little edges that angle downwards nicely. We have that large domed acrylic crystal, champagne-coloured sunburst dial, and Esquire described them as Art Deco numerals. I beg to differ. They're a little bit more Art Nouveau in my opinion, because they're less blocky, less symmetrical, and if you look at the 8s, part of it's cut off, but definitely very, very 60s. And it's interesting that they chose this particular one, this 1965 version, to reissue, because it's probably the most 60s it gets in terms of especially the numerals. That dial, without a shadow of a doubt, is its best feature. And I'm glad they went with this particular style of champagne sunburst effect. The way it radiates outwards is mesmerizing. It's extremely attractive. It does draw attention, but without being loud. Does it in a classy way. And that, I think, is what drew me into the Marlin in the first place. So this time we have black hands. We don't have any loom or anything, but what is nice is I thought the numerals are printed, but they are actually applied. They're very, very slender, a little bit more slender than on the originals, if you see there. Now, you'll also notice that the original has waterproof written on the dial. They've done away with waterproof at 6 o'clock, mainly because these days legally you can't say waterproof, but they have put it on the case back. It is, of course, 30 meters water resistant. Case back is extremely faithful to the old ones, with a little cheeky kind of circa 2017 there. I do like that. And as indicated by 44, that tells you the year it was produced. So the case back, it's a snapback, and you see the little thumbnail groove at the bottom. All entirely high polished except for this section on the back where it is engraved with the basic details. And this time, however, we do have drilled lug holes, which is fantastic, because these things, as you can see by the suede fluke I've put on mine, they are absolute strap monsters, and especially for such a dressy piece, you're going to have a lot of fun dressing them up, dressing them down. They look great even on a NATO strap, although, I'm sure a lot of you will disagree. So the dial is kept very, very simple. The luster of the champagne effect is a little bit more exaggerated than the originals. It's also a bit of a richer gold tone, more of a yellower tint to it. It's also a little bit darker, minute markings around the edge, and a wonderful distortion as you view it from an angle. You can even see the hands and the numerals from the side. It captures that vintage look and aesthetic beautifully. So let's get the dimensions out of the way. We're looking at 34 millimeters in diameter. The height is just a smidgen under 10 millimeters. Lug to lug, we're looking at 41 millimeters, and the lug width is 18. So they've really kept faithful to the original size and scale. I mean, if you hold them side by side, the measurements are identical. The only slight difference is the case and the lugs are a minuscule amount more substantial. I'm not sure if they've done that for the drilled lug holes or because it's stainless steel, but it is a little bit thicker. Although difference in weight is only about a gram. Hardly noticeable, the same shape is there, but we mustn't forget that the variety within the Marlin range, especially the 60s, is quite great. The bezel is ever so slightly larger. The crown, though, is almost identical. And what's interesting, even though they are identical, with this new movement, they're a little bit more easier to wind. It's a bit more of a pleasurable experience. So let's discuss the movement. Well, inside this time, however, they've gone for a Chinese Seagull ST6 movement. And there was a lot of debate when this was released of what movement it was. Timex never state exactly the caliber. The Seagull ST6, which has been going since about 1975. It's a manual wind 20 joule movement that operates at 21,600 vibrations an hour. The 40-hour power reserve is very reasonable. What is fantastic is as you pull out the crown to set the time, you see it is hackable. So very cool indeed. Now, these particular calibers of movements are absolutely minute. They were designed and intended for women's watches. They're not the most accurate in the world. They're about plus minus. I think the deviation on the standard is about 30 seconds. This particular one is operating at about plus 11, which is quite admirable, especially at this price range. What is very interesting is they are actually decorated. We have faux blued screws and a little bit of engraving. One of the wheels is even skeletonized. If you compare it to an undecorated version, they've actually taken the time to decorate them, which is quite astonishing, especially at this price range. However, because it's such a tiny movement, it's framed by a keeper, which is plastic, not very desirable. So a little bit bizarre that they decorate it, but then they'd go with a very small movement, I guess because it's one of the most affordable Seagulls. It's certainly an upgrade from the original numbers 24 and 25 calibers of the 60s. On the original 65 version of this, they had the caliber, I think it's the number 24. They were very, very rudimentary, utilitarian. You could almost say ugly, perhaps even brutalist. But they weren't there to be aesthetically pleasing. They were, to be honest, complete triumphs of engineering. Notice how different it looks. These were made from simple plates held in by rivets, not screws, almost impossible to open without breaking them. And they didn't have any jewels. They provided relatively trouble-free timekeeping with nothing superfluous, intended for efficiency, nothing else, at an extremely affordable price. In fact, they were almost feared by the more higher end. They were a threat. So the difference in the looks of the movements is massive. But you must never forget that this was, 60 years ago, and you can pick up Timex Marlins on the used market, wind them up, and they still go. It's quite incredible. So they do have a longevity, and this can only be done by a company that has experience in making durable, military technology. That's what they would do. They made the timing fuses for artillery, for the American Army, and of course the Air Force with those navigational gyros. That is why the Marlin is so integral to Timex, and probably the most important watch that they should have honored and reissued. You could almost say it's indicative of that boom era in the post-war America, before it all went a little bit pear-shaped in the 70s and so on. So let's pop it on the wrist and see how it wears. So for me, with my tiny wrist, my wrist is about 6.25 inches. It wears marvelously well. It's a true dress watch. It does exude the sophistication of the age, the feel of the age. It feels like a vintage watch should. The weight is 29 grams, only 1 gram heavier than the original. On the wrist, it's a real pleasure to wear. The way the dial, that sunburst radiates, and it has that kind of a wonderful effect as you move it. Much more exaggerated than the original. That's something they certainly kind of upgraded. It has a little bit more pizzazz to it. At the same time, it's magnified by the distortions of the acrylic crystal. I'm glad they didn't change that too much. The strap, I've got to say, is quite nice. Usually I complain about the straps that these more affordable watches come on, but it's very nicely embossed, has a nice gloss to it, doesn't look cheap, and it feels quite nice. But, guys, you're not buying this for the strap. I mean, just imagine this on my suede. I mean, it really would come alive to a whole new level. It's quite wearable. It's not bad at all. The only thing I'm not too fond of is this more of a subdued, polished buckle. I think it's a bit too modern. Although it is signed, it doesn't really go with the aesthetic of this, very quite delicate lugs. It's a little bit more modern. If you look at the buckle that came on my Fluco, this would really complement the watch much better. It has almost a similar curve to it. Very minor detail. I'm complaining about buckles. It's quite ridiculous. I love the step up with that domed crystal and framed by the bezel beautifully. It has a really nice profile. The shape to it's very, very 60s. It does wear beautifully as a dress watch. Also, because that dome, just any cuff will just slide over it gracefully. Yeah, it is almost the perfect dress watch. Perhaps a tiny bit too tall. Even thinner would have been nice, but then again, you'd lack the charm of that domed crystal. So let's summarize the watch. Well, first of all, I think it's really a great sign of things to come. The Timex are making mechanical watches again. This isn't the first time the Marlin has been reissued. A 50s version was reissued in the early 2000s, I believe only in quartz, however. But what it indicates is the fact that they are paying attention to the watch enthusiasts market. The fact that they haven't gone oversized, it's quite daring, staying in the 34mm size. In a way, it's clever because sizes, the trend for smaller sizes is coming back. I know I've been banging on about it for several years now. But trends and styles, they take a while to permeate outwards from the big cities, the style leaders like places like London and New York and Milan. With watch trends, it's a little bit slower than that. It's not as immediate as the fashion industry, for example. The watch itself hasn't been dramatically reinvented. They didn't need to, because this is a hugely important watch for Timex. It was from the 50s and the 60s, we mustn't forget, was the peak of Timex. It was, at the time in America, 1 out of every 3 watches sold was a Timex. They were hugely successful. They were the largest manufacturers of timepieces in the world, but not only timepieces. As one advert will beautifully illustrate, they produced navigational gyros for the military. There's a stunning, really cool Marlin advert with an XB-52 Boeing Stratofortress, and it kind of demonstrates how their marketing has changed from tough, durable watches that can take a beating and you can plunge in the pool. Nowadays, they've reinvented the image. They've teamed up with fashion designers in New York, sponsored reviews in Esquire and that kind of thing. They're marketing it more towards a kind of gentlemanly lifestyle part of the market, which I think is a clever move. It fits it very well. And you've got to bear in mind that most people that are buying $200 watches who are reading Esquire, I get asked every day, what is a mechanical watch? What is an automatic? What's the difference between quartz and automatic? So they're aiming really at the new watch enthusiast, or the soon-to-be watch enthusiast. It's almost the gateway watch, something that is hand-wound rather than just battery-operated. It's a welcome alternative to a price range that is dominated by the Japanese, especially Seiko, Citizen, Orient. By bringing something that has class, that is tastefully done, to a new audience, and I think that's wonderful. You certainly don't get any of the risks of the vintage market. It can be risky, buying the original, and that's a lot of people say, well, for $200, why don't you just buy the original? And I totally concur, but you have to know what you're doing when you're buying vintage watches. You can get stung, certainly. However, the vintage will always have the real heritage. They do have a certain magic that I feel the new one kind of lacks in a little bit. I don't know if that's just my psychology or the fact that I know it's vintage, but perhaps with this, a little bit of patina and a little bit of wear and tear, it might, you'll forget all about it maybe. Timex, without a doubt, have that watchmaking legacy to their name. And this is why I wanted to include the Waterbury, this barely 100, well, I think it's about $110, little 38mm quartz piece with the classic military-inspired design. with, of course, one of their own proprietary technologies, the Indiglo, as you can see there. You just hold down the crown. It's just a fantastic backlight. Look at how the numerals are. Instead of having loom applied there, you read it by the silhouette. Very cool. So this is, just a smidgen over $100, but it's in a smaller size. You have no date, 24-hour military time there. A very clean, classic design with a great strap. Just imagine if they implemented a mechanical manual wind like the military watches that they did, they would just knock it out of the park. And this is what this watch actually gets me really excited about what Timex could possibly do next. I mean, they could dominate. They already are dominating the entry-level watch market. So I think this is a really exciting sign of things to come. And of course, the negatives, well, we should discuss the negatives as well. It is going to be too small for a lot of wrists, but you guys got to remember that for most of the 20th century, 34, 6, 38 even was the norm for most men. But I think they are preemptively quite cleverly paying attention to watch trends. For me, I respect that they went to 34. It is too small for a lot of people. That's absolutely fine. And I totally understand that. Personally, I'm not a fan of this style of numerals with the 12, 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. I would have preferred this setup, but I think that's just a matter of taste. I'm not a fan of the buckle. Minor gripe, that is, I just don't think stylistically it fits. It has this kind of utilitarian, toolish look to it, whereas the watch is remarkably elegant and quite sophisticated. It just doesn't go. Very minor thing, you can change the strap. Another negative, well, I've seen a lot of people complain it's too expensive at $200, and they are going up in value as they begin to sell out. There was a bit of a craze, an excitement when they hit the market in the first place. But whatever watch you're going to have, there's always going to be people complaining, oh, it's too expensive. I mean, what do you expect? God forbid they make some profit, Look, I don't think $200 is distasteful. I think it's quite fair. You are getting an icon. How much of that are you paying for the name and for the history and the heritage? Well, that's an emotional thing. It's unquantifiable. You can't really put a price on it. I think it's a fair price. Anymore, and I think it does start to get a little bit silly. And I've seen a lot of price gouging going on eBay and in the used market, which is just ridiculous. People trying to take advantage of this Timex. I don't think it'll be the last Timex, the mechanical Timex. I think this is a sign of things to come. Perhaps they were testing the water. Yeah, overall, a great, cracking little watch. You can be proud of. You can certainly hand down the next generation. Just as a lot of my viewers also inherited their Marlins from their parents, especially in my American audience. It holds a special place in a lot of people's hearts, and I can certainly see why. I would like to end on what Esquire called their short little article on this reissue. They said a $200 watch that looks like $1 million, and I got to agree with that. That's what drew me into the Marlins in the first place. They exude that sophistication of that Mad Men era. We can't all afford Rolex Explorers and JLC Memovoxes. That was also in Mad Men. But $200 or even $50 to $100, you get the vintage one. I think it's cracking value for money. It's an icon of horology at a decent price. I really hope that Timex will start to introduce more mechanical timepieces, especially to their military-inspired designs. Their designs recently, I mean, you guys saw the Navy Harbor from their Heritage line. That just blew me away. Okay, yeah, it's just the quartz, very basic quartz, but I just adored the design. It was totally its own thing while still balancing classic vintage design cues, but at the same time it had its own personality. It was a cool size, and a great price. A watch like that in a mechanical or even an automatic would be phenomenal. I would love it. Another big negative has to be mentioned is the lack of transparency when it comes to the movement. It's an important thing. The movement counts. It should be listed on their website. Why they don't declare this kind of information, I guess it's because their main demographic is the wider public, not necessarily watch enthusiasts like us that obsess about every little jewel and screw and balance wheel and all the rest of it. So while they're doing an excellent job of reinventing the image and making it seem the accessory of every dapper urbanite gentleman, they have unfortunately neglected to keep the watch enthusiast in mind. Anyway, guys, I'm going to leave it there. Just lastly, I just want to say a massive thank you to Michael for lending his Marlin in to review. Please don't forget to add your thoughts, queries, comments, opinions, all the rest of it down below. Thank you very, very much for watching. Please don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it and found it useful. And as always, guys, I will catch you in the next one. Okay, ciao.